The 1937 Housing Act was passed as part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal reform programs. These were laws passed by Congress, as well as presidential executive orders that were aimed at bringing relief to the unemployed working class of the Great Depression, and not necessarily to the worst of society's poor. Public housing at the time consisted of 2- and 3-story walk-up and garden apartments, which were financed by setting rents to cover costs. It was not until the late 1950s that high-rise public housing projects began to emerge in many of the nation's larger cities, such as Chicago. As tenant makeup, site selections, design, and financing for these public housing projects changed, so did the quality of the programs and the outcome of their results. Public housing went from aiding temporarily specific segments of the working class that found itself in need, to a life sentence of poverty, destitution, and unemployment of large portions of minorities in our city. Slums were not new to Chicago or any other major city before the Great Depression. Immigrants and many other impoverished groups were known to have lived in very substandard areas that had health, sanitary, and safety issues. Many agreed that it was a human right to at least have a decent place to live, no matter how poor. The Chicago Housing Authority was established in 1937 exactly for that reason. Many saw this to be the responsibility of government, both local and federal. In the 1930s and 40s, Chicago was in the midst of a housing shortage, with tenant waiting lists for future sites. In order to establish who would receive housing and simultaneously eliminate slums and blighted areas, a strict criteria was established for future tenants. This criteria took into account a tenant's employment status, income, marital and parental status, age, condition of previous housing, and citizenship. It seems that although the housing program was established to bring relief to the underprivileged and impoverished, it immediately infringed upon people's constitutional rights by being selective, if not altogether discriminatory, based on a person's status and personal circumstance. After World War II, many white working class people who didn't qualify for public housing did qualify for low interest rate government mortgages. Whites began the movement into suburban areas, leaving blacks concentrated in the inner cities. This started the downward shift of income in the public housing population after the 1940s. Once again, the government produced an income-based inequality that was discriminatory in nature. The view of those that saw the deplorable conditions of tenements and destitute neighborhoods was that decent living conditions were a human right and necessary for the opportunity to better the lives of many Americans. They saw this as a state responsibility that would create equal opportunities for all. Unfortunately, he has created in most cases since the 1950s quite the opposite. Regulations were set up by the city and federal government for the construction of new multi-level high-rises with better circulation, more light, and better basic amenities found in the home and the community. The introduction of the Housing Act of 1949 introduced the subsidized housing income limits and caps on rents. African Americans who had less opportunities in employment, business, and living option were targeted as prime candidates for this program. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ironically also contributed to the final influx of whites out of the city and into the suburbs, by racially integrating the project. People who could afford to move out did. Only the poorest of the poor were left behind without many options. In the 1960s, as more high-rises and other buildings were being erected for public housing, many aldermen were resistant to bringing these programs to their wards. Therefore, almost all were built in black neighborhoods. Chicago thus had some of the most segregated public housing in the U.S. Even after a lawsuit to challenge these practices, Chicagoans still continued them. Eventually, the Chicago Housing Authority began to issue Section 8 vouchers, which allowed residents to move to different parts of the city and rent from privately owned buildings, while their rent was subsidized by the city. Some of the Chicago's more infamous mid-high-rise projects included the Robert Taylor Homes, Cabrini Green, the Ida B. Wells Homes, and the Henry Horner Homes. Many of the vast problems associated with these and other housing complexes stems from poor design and or inefficient funding that led to their shoddy and substandard construction. After the poor conditions associated with tenements and other slum landlord area housing Planners felt the modern design high-rises were the way to go as far as architecture. With land being expensive and limited, it was thought that multi-story buildings would solve the problem as well as provide a new and exciting environment to live in. Although building these units were more expensive, it was argued that the benefits outweighed the initial cost. What was not foreseen was the extensive maintenance cost of such developments that would drain an already financially strained program. Limits were put on basic amenities to cut costs and encourage residents to better themselves. Funding had been an issue since the inception of the Housing Act of 1937. Public housing was funded by Congress, which failed to provide for all the units it had authorized initially.
As the neighborhood changed, and as the neighborhood you started getting less residents over there, and had more vacancies, a lot of that kind of funding left the neighborhood. And the less people you have, the less funding you have, the more vacancies you have, the less resources you have in the neighborhood. And that's when it became real bad.
Tall buildings were built with elevators that did not operate. Closet doors were left off. Kitchen and bathroom facilities were incomplete and many times not functioning. Bars and steel mesh were added to windows and outdoor walkways. There was a lack of green space and recreational facilities that made the complexes stark and depressing. Metal fencing which separated the units from their neighborhood made it difficult for the police to patrol. The prison-like monolithic buildings were cold and gloomy. Separating the complexes from the slum neighborhood was thought to benefit the resident. The result was just the opposite.
2 weeks ago, 2 Chicago policemen were shot to death by snipers at a housing project. 4 suspects were arrested. Mayor Daley said he would spend $3 million on security and services at the project, Cabrini Homes, but black leaders say it's typical of all that's bad about low-income public housing.
These are the children of the Cabrini Project. Most are fatherless, most are poor, and most of them have little hope for the future.
In the 1960s, the breakdown of the family contributed to much of the social unrest and misery associated in these communities. Women-headed households with a number of children that greatly outnumbered adults, and gang activity fueled by drugs and criminal violence led to a suppression of both the physical and mental state of the residents that had once been so proud. With the lack of a family structure, moral stability was non-existent. Many children grew up witnessing violence and self-deprivation. Education opportunities were few, and crime was so common that it discouraged normal activities. This fueled more and more vacancies in the public housing complexes, for the apartments and their locations were now undesirable. This caused a vicious cycle of lax security, low maintenance, and eventually neglect on part of both local and federal governments. The government had become the slum landlord that they had once tried to reform. The good intentions of the New Deal programs and their planners, which were to eliminate destitute and deplorable slums, had created slums and ghettos that were even worse, and now government sanctioned. The government had failed in its promised responsibility to provide relief for impoverished families. It had just created a new class of disenfranchised and racially discriminating against people. By the 1990s, many of the problematic public housing projects in Chicago eventually were beyond reform and thus demolished or renovated. Many were sold to private developers that built condos and other new privately owned housing. Residents were relocated throughout the city and suburbs. Today, many question the government's ability to provide effective solutions and wonder if they propagate new and more complex problems. Responsible, effective, private, and governmental solutions, along with tenant responsibility, may be the answer.
A large percentage I blame on the government. A large percentage I blame also on some of the residents who allow for the morals and the culture to change.